The process of creation has taken eternities. The process of creation was not the work of a moment, even though it truly would have been within my power, but then creation would have missed its purpose, since it was intended to ensure a gradual development from the abyss to the pinnacle and therefore continued for an infinitely long time. Hence you humans should understand that the description in the scriptures, in the book of the fathers, only informs you of this act of creation in a pictorial manner, because people who still lack deeper awareness would be unable to understand the true process, and it is only intended to teach them that creation once came forth from my hand, that it was and is the work of my will and my might. Anyone who wants to delve deeper will also come to a more profound understanding. At first it is only necessary to know of a power which brought everything into existence the human being can see around himself, as well as the creations he is unable to see. Before the far-reaching correlations can be explained to him, he has to know about the original beginning of what my strength of love emanated as independent beings. And he has to know about these beings' apostasy from me and the immense original sin with which the beings were then burdened. Only then can the emergence of creation and the process of return through creation be explained to him. But anyone with an unenlightened spirit will hold on to the letter and will never clearly understand it, since he is not open to instructions by spiritually enlightened people either. Every work of creation required an infinitely long time of preliminary development which, however, always related to the spiritual substance which should progress within a work of creation. It had fallen so low that it also needed an endless length of time in order to ascend again within the various kinds of creations, from the most primitive to the most beautifully formed works brought into existence by my will in order to shelter the spiritual substance and enable its path of ascent. And therefore, the creation work Earth, too, was, in the beginning, a mere cluster of utterly immature spirits whose substances gradually condensed to form a mass which could not yet be described as hard matter but had to be understood as basic elements, without form but with tremendous effect of strength, for they contained totally uncontrolled spiritual substances. Yet my wisdom distributed everything in the right measure and used every element for my creative work, so that separate forms arose which had to comply with their destined purpose. And thus began the slow construction of the visible works of creation which continued for an endless time until the earth started to show vegetation and increasingly more mature spiritual substances were able to occupy those creations to travel the path of higher development in this plant world. Then followed the first living beings, creations, which could already perform a certain, albeit very small, task imposed on them by natural law. And, again, an infinitely long time of development passed from these minute living beings to the world of animals which included ever larger and stronger forms, in which many spiritual substances had already come together and united in order to keep fulfilling the task of cultivating the earth for the final crowning work of divine creation, for the human being, who had to pass through all those preliminary stages and whose soul now is the composition of all those tiny particles which belonged to a once fallen original spirit and which, in a dissolved state, had to go through all works of creation in order to gradually evolve again in this way. Consequently, the human being could not have been created at the time of creating the world, just as all works of creation have never been my instant work, precisely because the slow advancement had to proceed first, or the whole of the creation work would have been meaningless and without purpose. For it did not come into being for my sake but for the sake of my fallen living creations, and thus was also meant to fulfill the purpose of leading the fallen spirits back to me again. And yet, every work of creation was my externalized thought which was always implemented when the spiritual substance had reached a certain degree of maturity and required a new form in order to continue its path of development. And thus, different creations arose periodically. The plant world only became necessary when the world of rocks released the spiritual substance which then required a new and lighter form. And likewise small and minute living creations arose after the creation of the plant world. And only I knew when one was necessary for the other, and I also knew how much time the larger living creations, the animals up to the pre-Adamites, would need to mature their embodied soul substances. Hence, I also knew when the time had come that the individual tiny particles of the spiritual being had merged again in order to embody itself as soul in the last form. Then I externalized a work of creation again, the human being, whose external shape is so skillfully created that a maturing to final perfection will be possible. And this creation of the human being also occurred an infinitely long time ago, which you humans cannot establish since your concept of time is still limited, but my work of return has already lasted for an eternity. And although eternities had passed before the appearance of the human being, before the earth with all its works of creation was ready for the human being to take possession of it for the purpose of his final maturing, this point in time is also very remote, because time and again periodical immense upheavals and changes occur on earth which make it impossible to calculate the duration of time since the beginning of earth and of the human being. But this is certain, you humans will only be able to gain a real insight into my eternal plan of salvation when you have attained the appropriate degree of enlightenment yourselves. For until then you will be intellectually incapable to envision the length of time for which the concept of eternities could be applied. And for as long as your spirit is still unenlightened it has to be explained to you in an illustrative manner. Only an awakened spirit will be able to gain deeper insight, yet ultimate wisdom will only become explicable when it enters the kingdom of light where everything can be revealed because everything will then also be comprehensible. Amen.